everybody, Sam here. Welcome back to the Truvle podcast.
Hey everyone, John here, and today we're going to be speaking about the transition state, that period of time that comes after you've analyzed what your current state is, what you want to get done, a solution you want to implement, and before it's part of normal operations. And this is a really exciting area for us because Sam introduced a real innovation in this space that has had significant implications to our science and our ability to add a lot that has not existed in this space. So, with that, I'll ask Sam for you
Yeah, I
to
appreciate
talk about it.
I appreciate the nod toward innovation, but to be frank with everybody, this is really a model that's very well known in chemistry and taught in 100 level classes all over the country. I just really saw a parallel that wasn't really being spoken about in business, and I started to adapt some of the chemical models of what we call transition states over to business analogs. And I created some graphs and I started socializing it. And I think it really does, to Jonathan's point, create a powerful visual and a powerful way to think about how we transition from one operating model to another, essentially. And I know we're throwing around a lot of terms here. I see Jonathan nodding his head. So this is a very fascinating topic for us. That's why we're excited. We're kind of goofing around trying to, how do we best share it? But when we talk about an as is state and a to be state for process or operating model, we're talking about, let's just set the stage for an example. Jonathan, do you have an example? You always like setting simpler examples, like maybe insurance, or we could do law
Ju-
or
You're just
lemonade stand.
implementing some sort of system.
Yeah.
That always is right.
Well, let's do lemonade stand. I like that one. It's sort of the
Okay, or
proverbial
let's not do a
use
system.
case. You could do a system in a lemonade stand.
Lemonade stand. Go, go, go.
Yeah, I'm putting in a new system in my lemonade stand. Well, anyway, we know lemonade stand is doing how they're doing it today. Let's say you start manually, 25 cents a cup. You're just mashing lemons, sugar, and water and doing the real lemonade stand thing. That's your as is process. So let's start there. And you could say it's your as is operating model. Now, let's say your boss comes in, the CEO of the lemonade stand, says, we need to automate, we need to put in a new system, we need to change the process materially. So instead of you mashing the lemons by hand with one of those plastic squeezer things. I don't really know the name of that thing. It's the thing, the plastic thing that you jam into a lemon wedge. Anyway, we're
A
going to do a
mash.
machine, a masher. Yeah. We're going to put a machine in there that you just load the lemons into and automatically mashes them. Well, that is a change. And that would be your to be state, your intended to be operation or operating model. So we'll use them sort of interchangeably because operating model could refer to a whole company, but it's still, we're talking about process changes. So when people think about the in between, how do we get from using one tool in a process that we know to using a different tool in a process we don't know? That's the area between A and B that we call the transition state. And that transition state, one would say in most cases, is kicked off by a project, or a project is supposed to be the thing that's making the transition happen. So you have your regular operation, then you have your projects happening. And everything we're talking about in the transition state is in the requirements and the energy and the changes that happen before you go from A, or your current process, to a stable future process. So before I just start rambling on, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, just in the example that Sam said, it would seem pretty clear. Oh, this is just a positive change. You're just putting in something into a machine that's going to do something that you did differently. And one of the themes that we're going to be talking about is that change always equals cost. There is no skipping the activation energy that it takes for a process to occur or a process to change. And Sam, I'll ask you to just talk about that a little more because I actually think it's really fascinating. But before I do that, in the case of this masher, everyone say, "Well, okay, what's the big deal? It shouldn't add any time." And what do you mean? There's cost, of course, the cost of the masher. But you have to think. Then there's like a danger. Maybe someone can start hurting their hand in it or something. So you have to put a precaution around it. You need to train your lemonade stand workers. You need a plug and an electricity source. Maybe you didn't think about, oh, what if it's raining or something like that. So there is no change that occurs that doesn't have cost associated.
That's the critical, yes, that's the critical part. It's about the cost of change. And even now that we've just created this lemonade example on the spot, I'll riff off of it because it's not just, okay, there's some electricity impact and somebody has to be retrained. But if I'm the CEO and I'm just like, just put the new machine in and just start using it, Well, I don't realize that, an automated lemon masher can mash 50 lemons per minute, whereas by hand I can only do 6. So now I've got lemon juice in excess to what I can do by hand with my sugar and water mixing. And now I've got lemons sitting on the side going bad while I'm trying to keep up. And I can't do so, these are the things that you never think about. You think I'm just going to plug and play with every process. I'm going to swap things in and out. But changes have resonance impacts through process. It cannot be avoided.
And the common mistake that we always see is people always assume that if it's clearly a positive change, it can only make people more efficient, that there is no cost to it, that there is no additional concern about cost. And I use another analogy because Sam, you asked me to give an analogy. I always say if we went from like one of those old time Blackberries, and I gave you a brand new iPhone, uh, and you would say, well, clearly that's light years ahead. It's so much better. There's absolutely no question. When you got that iPhone, no matter how much better that improvement is, you wouldn't even be able to make a phone call. It would take time for you to figure that. In fact, I don't even know if you'd be able to answer a phone call. I'm trying to think how I used to answer it on a BlackBerry. So I don't know if actually BlackBerry now dates me, but I don't even know,
A little
if
bit.
you'd be able to do that. So you first you need training. So you'd have downtime. You wouldn't be able to access your contacts. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that you need to know, and that goes to let's call it the second fundamental, which is it's not the quality of the change that determines the cost and the effort in the transition state. It's always the delta between where you are and where you're going. That is
Yeah.
always going to be what's going to be the biggest impact.
Yeah, and you talked about activation energy. I actually think the phone example is a perfect one to talk about the activation energy piece of it, because I'm sure everyone on the line right now has had this, especially now in the new times where you're constantly iterating your technology, or even when you're going from, Microsoft 2016 to 2020 or whatever it is, there's always this resistance, at least in me, and I assume that I'm actually fairly tech savvy of, oh great, here's the next upgrade. I've just gotten used to the version I have. Like the phone one is a perfect example. Let's say I'm even going from iPhone 6 to iPhone 9 or whatever it is, because I've just taken a few years because of this cost of change. It's not that you don't know it's going to be better when you settle into it, or you learn the new process, or that they've improved something. There is a hesitation there because you have to change what you're doing. There is an activation energy. You have to muster the energy to get over the hump of like making the change and going through the adoption curve and learning something new to do the same thing you're doing now. And that's universal. That's for groups, it's for projects, it's for anything. If you're trying to take one process that's in place and has momentum behind it and change it to another one, you've got transition cost. And in order to make the change successfully, you have to pay the piper, right? You have to pay enough activation energy to get over the hump. And in that time, no matter where you're going, if it's more efficient, it's costly to get there because you've got to sit down and do it. How many of you on the line have said, okay, I have to make an hour or two time for this next software upgrade? Because if I just do it on the fly in the middle of my workday, I might have disastrous results. And that's kind of what we're talking about. And if you don't give it the proper energy to get through it, you may stop in between, just throw up your hands in frustration and say, I'm going to have to roll this back right now. I just don't have time. I don't have the time or the effort to understand what this is doing right now in the midst of everything else. And then you revert because you just didn't give it enough of the energy it needs to go through the change properly.
And Sam's raising the human element also by making it about the individual as opposed to just like all the project costs associated. And something else to remember in any change, you're probably going to have about 30% of the people affected by the change be against it, no matter what it is. So, and that's something that requires, preparation, training, alignment, reasoning, reasons why you're doing it. We're not going to get into change management and that, but there's a cost associated with all of that. And no matter what, so you could have a free we give $1 out every Monday to every employee, and you're going to have 30% of people say this is a trick, this isn't good, don't take the dollar, so you'll always have that, and that's in addition to a person who wants to do it, as Sam was saying, and realizes that they better not do it at a time when their productivity can take a hit. And that's another thing that we always see in these scenarios, that people aren't thinking about the whole portfolio and everything that's impacting the individual.
Well, and that is the transition state, and the activation energy, and the cost of the transition. Like that whole
Right.
thing you just said about impacting productivity, which is that, okay, even though we know after we go through this change it's going to be better and it might be more efficient or require less energy in the to be process or whatever we're thinking, in the change, there's going to be a heightened stress on the operation. There's going to be an increased stress, which is that activation energy we're talking about, which you're going to have to budget for and you're going to have to provide to the system overall for the change to happen. Because if you tell your group, okay, you're going to switch, all of you are going to switch over to the new phone version, but you have to do it instantly. We're not going to give you a break. We're not going to give you any time to acclimate to the new technology. You can't slip in your productivity for a minute. Does that sound familiar? It kind of sounds crazy when you put it that way, but that's what project work is for a lot of organizations. They don't even acknowledge the transition, and they've done all this planning to think it's going to make it better. But before it gets better, it's going to get worse every time. This is one thing that I know, Jonathan, you and I have run together, even our own business dealings, where I have people I brief them before we get into a project and sign off that they know, hey, when the going gets tough, which it will every time inevitably, you have to stand strong and tell your people, hey, this is going to be a lot worse for a period while we transition from one to the other. And you've got to ride through that. There's no avoiding that. But I think everyone thinks it's just not going to happen or they're going to avoid it. Or we see that a lot, I should
And
say.
I agree, productivity is the main one, no question about it. But then, if depending on what system you're implementing, people don't always think about, oh, you might have to actually make changes to other systems to incorporate this system, and that's a cost. You have additional technology costs, and the like. So there's, depending on what we're speaking in fairly broad terms in terms of projects, and these are universal what we're saying. But if it's a specific kind of project where you're implementing technology, a big problem that we always see is that people aren't thinking about how that's going to actually live in the to be state. And maybe there's additional technology even that's required, or configuration or the like.
And in our haste to kind of jump into the business mechanics, maybe I think it'd be worth going back to the chemistry we mentioned, because I feel like we teased it. And what is the chemical model that we're referring to that kind of led to this transition state as far as project work and business goes? Well, in chemistry, it's sort of a well-known thing. And now that I'm speaking about it in public space, I just became acutely aware that maybe I don't know my chemistry as well. So fact check me and take this with a grain of salt, basically. But you have molecules that, as part of nature, they're constantly going through configuration changes. So they change from one form to another. And when they're floating around in their life, they don't just spontaneously change from one form to another. They're usually trying to change from a higher energy state to a lower energy state, because that's just sort of the way of the universe. Everything is trying to get down to a lower energy state to maintain itself. And to do that, though, you'd think, well, why doesn't every molecule just do that constantly? Well, there's barriers, and the barriers are this activation energy we're talking about. So unless it has a surge of heat or a spike of another chemical in the system, or let's say, electricity strikes and it gets like an electrical burst, it doesn't have enough energy to change from one to the other, even though the other is obviously at a lower energy state. It has to stay in its form until it's given like this big bolt, this jolt of extra juice essentially, so that it can get over the hump, because it takes extra energy to change from one to the other. So it's almost like you have to think about it, and nothing in nature unlocks the benefit of being in a lower energy configuration unless it has a large stockpile of energy or a large burst of energy to get from one to the other. And that's the model that we're basically saying is a direct analog to project work. And if you look at the mechanics in the workplace as a practitioner, you see it constantly. And the lack of acknowledgement is what Jonathan and I are talking about here. The lack of acknowledgement that that state exists throws a lot of projects to their death, I guess I would say, not to be too extreme.
And bringing it into the business world, so you're starting at one set of cost for your current operation. So you're at, let's say, $100. And so if you think of a graph that has cost and resources going around the up axis, then that's your steady cost, for your operation. The activation energy is the cost that it's going to take, where your costs are going to go up for a period of time until the change takes and it reduces the cost of your current operations, which is really the goal. Most projects, or all projects, are either an investment to reduce the cost of current operations, or to seize an opportunity to find another revenue source. But either way, you're going to raise the cost of your operations in the short term, and there's no escaping that. So the graph would look like a straight line then a hump that goes up, just like the activation and energy that Sam is speaking about. And then you have a curve that goes all the way down that is lower than where you started.
Yeah, and to put the numbers to what what he started, if you have $100 a day for a process to run, and you're trying to get it down to $80 a day, obviously there's a huge benefit in doing that over time. But in that transition state, you may spike to $150 a day while you're juggling training your people, trying to manage the process as it runs. Because it's always in business, you've got a live process, and a live process, often you have to build the tracks while the train is going. That's generally how it is. And if you're going to do that, it's going to be costly, and that's that cost of change. So if I go $100 a day to $150 a day for a few weeks, and then I drop down to $80 a day for 6 months to a year till the next project, you can hopefully see very quickly the mathematics work out in your favor. But not if you don't make the investment and you don't plan for all that extra cost in that activation phase during the transition. Because if you don't do that, and then you start ramping up to $150 a day and you get scared and you revert or you go backward, or the project fails halfway through and you actually get locked up at $110 a day for that process, or you go backward to 100 after wasting all this money in the in between, that's where companies are hurting a lot, and they're eating it, and they don't talk about this. They don't talk about, okay, I've started this project, but I'm going to take a productivity hit in this middle part. Where's the extra training? Where's the extra budget? People talk about it in different ways, but the transition state, like we keep saying, is universal. It's not avoidable. So this is something that should be in every project plan, every conversation about this.
And one of the ways that it manifests itself so strikingly is that because people underestimate this transition state cost, the focus becomes on the solution. So let's say you're implementing a new system. Instead of remembering the reason why you're implementing the new system, you wanted to automate something, everybody just focuses on implementing the system, even if you don't get the benefits of automation because you haven't done the extra work required to standardize and get everybody to use the system the same way and whatever it is. So what ends up happening is people say, see, it didn't cost us a lot, or we didn't have to take this big hit to implement the system. But how many of you out there have ever been part of something where your company implements some worldwide system and nobody can really remember why? And there's this assumption that everybody understands the reason why, or the assumption of a benefit of it. But okay, now we have this new system, and then you have because you avoided the transition state, you have a lot of people who are suddenly doing all these side ways of doing things or workarounds in the new, which is because of all something waste, not wanting to add new waste in the service of making the solution work, as opposed to it being in the service of making the benefit of whatever the reason why you were implementing the system to be there.
And that's where the idea of as is and to be process starts to become more tangible, just to kind of relate it to what Jonathan was just saying. So as is process and to be process, if I'm trying to target, my project's trying to target $100 a day for a process to $80 a day for a process, and my solution to do that is getting a system in place. The solution was just a means to an end, reducing the cost and the burden of that process, making the process more efficient, making it less costly on a per unit time basis. So to Jonathan's point, if we start getting lost and you celebrate putting the system in, but the system reduced the cost of process to $99 a day or $101 a day, so it actually increased it, and nobody paid attention to what the process actually landed at because we cheated a bunch of stuff and we just got the system rolled out, but it actually didn't improve the process any, we're not really celebrating a win. We're celebrating somebody winning on getting the system up, and it's kind of a win in its face, but the why is not met. The value objective is not met.
The person that sold you the system, it's a win for them.
Yeah, they won. The consultant might have won.
It's always a win there, but probably not for your organization. Or maybe at some point, that transition state that you avoided, you're going to have to come back to. That debt will be there. There is no avoiding it. It's mutable. So ultimately, when people realize, wait, we're not getting what we thought out of the system, why did we spend so much money on the system? And it happens all the time. Then a new project comes to make the system work the way it's supposed to by doing all the work you should have done to make the system work as it was supposed to.
And it's another comment on what we're talking about when we say transition state, which is you have to know from a design perspective where you are and where you're trying to go. because if you're just talking about making a change, things change constantly, things change every day. The point is, when we're talking about this model, the model is assuming that you're actually trying to reduce the energy requirements of the process that you're looking at, that you're not just trying to make random changes for the sake of making changes. That if one is trying to get from a stable process to another stable process, it's got to go through this inviolate change transition period we're talking about. But there's a lot of things you got to start. I guess what I'm saying is assigning what you're seeing in the physical environment to what we're talking about, but they're not always one to one. That's the exercise, that's the experience. It can be kind of a difficult exercise sometimes, and that's part of how we like to think about it.
And this is tough because sometimes whoever's project this was, whoever senior VP's project this was, will judge everybody and rate them and performance reviews, etc., based on the system getting implemented. So people just, get in line with that, and there's no relationship to actual value to an organization. So this is just another really great example of how tremendous waste can exist. And to, I think, the point, and this is a theme that I'll keep coming back to, and another innovation that I'll give to Sam, that this idea of do nothings, or do no harm, and sometimes that meaning that we're not going to do any activity at all because the activity is wasteful. That's where another place it comes into play, because to the example that we're giving with implementing a new system, oftentimes it would have been better if nothing was done at all, if the project had have just been stopped right at the beginning.
Yeah, I love the do nothing. Let's just keep chanting in all of our podcasts. Just
Yeah,
stop. Stop the
I
stop
don't
the
think
wasteful behavior.
I don't think we're going to be successful there, because that's a major reason why so much waste exists, because people need to see activity, and people associate activity with productivity, and they don't associate it, and they don't know the difference between positive activity and wasteful activity.
Yeah.
So
Well, this is the big thing we mentioned earlier in terms of, okay, how do we act on this transition state? Well, if you can follow this conversation, it's coming no matter what kind of change or project you are. I mentioned it very quickly earlier. I started to get project sponsors signing off on it because the do no harm thing is also is one large principle, but a lot of managers go forward on project work with the idea that we need to be doing no harm to our staff. We can't bump up, like we can't disrupt current operations for whatever project we're trying to endeavor. And any sign of pain, there's such a strong pain avoidance response. That's what kills a lot of this project work. So I'm just kind of framing it back into a practical context. How many times have you started a project and everyone's like, yes, I want that benefit. Let's do it. Let's go full bore. And then as soon as the going the going gets tough and you're in the transition state and all the staff are complaining, they're all in pain, they don't understand the change, they thought this was supposed to make things better, nobody was told this was going to be harder, and they have to do all this extra work and overtime and training. And then the sponsor's like, I didn't sign up for this, and pulls it back. That's the situation that Jonathan's talking about, that you shouldn't have started. You shouldn't have gone in if you didn't know this was going to happen. And what are we saying in this podcast? When is it going to happen? Every single time. It's going to happen every time. There's no avoiding it, which is why I could put it in a field in my project charters and say, you have to sign up and acknowledge and tell your staff there's going to be a definite period of time here where it's going to be harder, worse, and more miserable. And it's not going to help. It's going to make things worse. And if you can't push through that, then you're not going to get to the result. And people have to know that. They have to know that going in.
And in the short term, it can feel ameliorative in that if the staff is saying, let's say, use that example, the staff unhappy, and management comes in and says, oh, we're going to make something better by implementing X. And even if people are excited at the beginning, if they haven't thought it through what the impact is, and then realizing, oh, we're not going to be able to get through this because it's too much cost, etc., even that period of time that was ameliorative, where people got excited, or people, for a while nobody was complaining because it seemed like management was doing something about something, what that's doing is actually increasing the debt that you're going to have to pay at a future project when you actually do try and address the project. And each failed project is increasing the activation energy of the next project, because now you have a lot more resistance. You have a lot more embedded ways of resisting even getting involved in something that might be potentially wasteful or harmful to somebody. So it's a very short-term thinking. Whereas even if people do nothing and then people think that nobody's doing anything about their lot, maybe individuals will organically improve something, but this appearance of doing activity, it actually stops even any positive activity from occurring. So it's very, very harmful, even if it feels good in the short term.
Yeah. And it comes back to, I think, what will be a common theme for our podcast and Truvle in general is it's a lack of awareness and a lack of transparency, which really hurts these things. Because to Jonathan's point, the staff and the change management factors that have had so much written about them lately, about, you've got a staff who's doing process, and if you really mess them up, or you lie to them, or you mislead them, and they become harder and more disenfranchised, it's going to absolutely raise the activation energy on any transition you contemplate going forward. But how do you avoid that? Do you avoid it by saying, hey, I'm going to give you a solution and you're not going to work for it, which is kind of what happens all the time? No, it's not that people don't want to do the work or work harder. If you start to get in a situation where we've seen so many times where the staff is working 40 hours and then suddenly 50 hours and then 60 hours a week, and they're starting to burn out and there's a lot of tension in the org, and you say, okay, we can't, this is a burning platform. We've got to put in a new system or a new solution, or help them get to a new process state. And you go in and say, we're going to help save you. And this happens all the time. And everyone gets excited, like Jonathan was talking about. They get all excited, but then they get into it, and then their workload goes from 60 to 70-hour a week to 80-hour a week, and nobody told them that. If you had said from day one, this is good change management, just being transparent, and now after the Truvle podcast, you're going to have to go through this no matter what kind of project you're working on. You go to them and say, listen, everybody, we're going to work late nights, we're going to retrain, we're going to retool, you're going to be working even harder for the next few months, but we're doing pizza parties, we're doing the thing, and then we should see the benefit. Most people would understand. Most people are not about not working hard. They just want to know what's going on. They don't want to be lied to. They don't want to be misled. And that starts with leadership knowing what they're getting people into, leaders knowing what they're leading their people into. It's so important. And you don't want to get to the point where your entire staff or organization doesn't trust any changes that you bring to the table, because you come with a lack of awareness every time that these things are immutable.
And that's where the transparency is so critical. If you, and we talked about this in earlier podcast about strategy being not in the domain of just leadership, that has to be throughout the organization. People can support something if they understand the why of it. They could even be inspired by it, but they can't support something if they don't know the why. If it's just use this new system because that's what we're telling you to do, that is not very effective in getting any organic or side or additional boost, because now you're just making it about whether or not the system's good or bad or whatever reasons people might have a problem with it. But if you say the why, then they can help in directing the energy toward the why actually happening. And Sam, you raised something that also made me think about an earlier podcast, organizational maturity. We spoke about capability of an entity. The organizational maturity has a direct relationship to the activation energy that's going to be required in the transition state. Because as an example, if you have no idea, if you have unstable operations where everyone's doing something very different, to the example Sam gave, even if you want to tell everybody this is what to expect, we're going to have pizza parties, but don't, this will be the problem, etc. In many instances, you don't even know, because you have unstable operations. And so you can't very well analyze, or at least not within a reasonable cost, what the potential impact will be to every single person's process. So again, but if you get to the why, then they can help make that jump. But an organizationally immature entity has an unstable as is. So that's very hard then to predict exactly what it'll take to get to the future much less expensive state.
Yeah, and it talks to, we're throwing out this model, this transition state and this activation cost model to get from states. And to Jonathan's point, he sort of introduced it softly there. There are things you can do to lower activation energy. So that, whereas I go from 100 to 150 to 80, like we've been throwing numbers around as an example, there are ways you can go from 100 to 80 with a period of 130 or 120 instead of 150. That activation energy will always be there, but the magnitude is not fixed. And when you think about organizational maturity, throwing in additional capability, really working with staff, effective change management, to Jonathan's point, clearly articulating the why and getting people involved at the right level, unlocking the power of your organization, that's where that activation energy goes down. And that's where you start really humming, because your cost of change goes down. That's really what we're talking about overall. because companies are trying to change constantly. They change to be reactive to the market. They change to get ahead of their competitors. Everyone is executing projects with the intention of changing from one process state to another for various reasons. And the companies that are going to be more competitive are the ones that can change for a lesser cost, because the cost of change is not giving any benefits itself. The
And
cost of the transition state is, you go ahead.
what you could do to help is the same exact fundamentals, same exact rules as what we said back in organizational maturity. So we mentioned transparency. Another one I'll say is focus. So, an example of going from a BlackBerry to an iPhone, if at the same time you say, oh, you know what, we're also going to give our staff brand new laptops. They're going to go from desktops to laptops, and they're state of the art. And then at the same time, you also gave them some other technology, amazing technology. That's not focus. That's actually now you're increasing your total transition state and making sure that not only will the original one potentially fail, but potentially all of them will fail because it's too much change and you need the focus. And that's again all positive. I would warrant that not all projects are potentially going to have the result, even if they are implemented perfectly, that everybody anticipates. Not every change is so clearly an upgrade because, as we said, sometimes these projects start for the wrong reasons. So again, if you look at the concepts that we're building upon in each one of these podcasts, they're going to apply uniformly. Having the why, having the focus, having the transparency, all of those things are going to make a very big difference about whether or not this particular effort is going to succeed.
Yeah, and I just had a cringy moment there as Jonathan activated my PTSD around people changing multiple things at one time, which is always the case. But it's focus. We're talking about scientific models. Let's talk about focus as it is as another model too, which is, this is in like sixth grade or seventh grade science, I think, where the scientific method talks about you should be looking to change. Sorry, we got a visitor on the podcast.
Well,
Go
when
on.
you're going to have when we're going to have topics like these, we're going to get people flocking. So
Yeah,
can't expect
and
otherwise.
expect people not to be flooding into to the podcast. So what I was saying is you need to be focusing on like science experiments say identify your independent variables, identify your dependent variables. If for those of you who maybe haven't been out of science for a while, but you need to be, when you experiment, you change one independent variable at a time, because otherwise, how can you attribute the changes or the additional costs or the impact of your changes to any particular variable that you're toggling? So now we're starting to get to additive models where these basic fundamentals start to add together and become more complex. So Jonathan talks about the transition state between A and B, but what if the process has 5 of those going on at one time, all with their own activation energy and all with different transition states? Then you have to start blending them together. So if I'm calculating my cost of change, if I'm making multiple changes simultaneously, now we're starting to get into more complex modeling. But the fundamentals are there the same way. But for people to say, there's no, you have to, that one thing is not affecting another. That's another silly thing that organizations do all the time, to be frank. I mean, it's like, where's your whole project portfolio? And now we're talking about additive transition states and multiple activation energy costs, and it goes on and on.
And this is the way that we're putting into the tool these concepts because they're so fundamental. Looking at a project portfolio through this lens gives you a very good idea of exactly the costs that they're going to be involved and whether or not it's even possible or likely to succeed. As just one example, there's obviously a lot of other factors, but this scientific method definitely gives us the ability to replicate the result and make it consistent throughout the organization in terms of the data we're analyzing and how it potentially will work for you or not work for you. So,
And a lot of times it's just when we talk about the fundamentals of business, it shouldn't sound that off to you. It should sound fairly intuitive. It's just it's easy to lose sight of what makes sense in the lemonade stand example for your multi, global international enterprise. Like for instance, if I said, okay, we go back to our lemonade stand, one staff member, and we say we're going to change your lemon squeezer to a machine, an automated machine. Okay, that makes sense. But what if I told them at the same time, I'm going to change your glass, I'm going to change the way you get water, and I'm going to change the way you sell and interact with customers simultaneously? One can start to get an intuitive red flag. Oh, that's a lot of things to change for that poor person at one time. That's a lot of things to change in the process in one time. How are you supposed to know what's going to work and what's not going to work?
Yeah.
But we do this all the time.
And
You
that
do this
gets
through your
to
business.
Yeah, and that gets to again, these concepts, they're all interlocking when you don't even take the time to analyze your as is state. And we covered this the last time, and really have a good sense of where you are. Then it is impossible to understand the impact that it might have, and you can introduce tremendous risk to the organization. And that's, I definitely want to make this point because it's really, really critical. We've seen it happen many times, and to a level of risk that it can actually imperil the organization itself. If you don't know what your current state is, you can't possibly understand the impact of implementing a change to that current state. That's obvious. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so logical. It's like the example we gave, like if you're out of shape and you don't know you're out of shape and you try, you jump into a river to swim to the other side, you're going to get somewhere and potentially drown before you get to the end because you're not aware of what your current state is. And that is the kind of danger and risk that we see organizations take all the time. And they take big ones. When we're talking, we mentioned a lemonade stand, but the fundamentals we're talking about, this is like would apply equally to a major acquisition, to a major implementation of a worldwide system. There's absolutely no difference between the scale of what we're talking about, or of what we're talking about to scale. Well, there's more cost, there's more, et cetera, but the fundamentals are identical. So you really do need to understand the as is. I'm just giving another plug to the analysis that people like to skip.
Yeah, or to minimize its impact. Well, and also I feel compelled to talk at this point about why companies fail. You always, I think a lot of times, at least for me and a lot of folks that I know, when you think about where companies go out of business, they like to think of some big bang, like, oh, Kodak got displaced by the digital camera, or like there was just a major disruption or something, like a meteorite that wiped out the dinosaurs, wiped out the company. It's not the case. Most of the time, it's people don't know how to change properly. Like, you have a successful business model in 1 year or 1 decade, and then things change. And a company's ability to survive is their ability to change. And if you think about what we've been talking about, transition states, activation energy costs, all these costs that you can't avoid, your whole goal as a company, if you want to be sustainable, is to reduce your cost of change.
Kodak's a great example because the first inventor of a digital camera, Kodak. So it wasn't like that's classic example because it wasn't because of their inability to innovate or understand what the next state could possibly be. It was the inability to adapt to it, of course. But that's a whole nother. That's a topic we can get to for another time.
Yeah, and it just highlights again, it's not that these companies might not even know what to do, it's that they've got to change to get there. So your ability to navigate change and understand the cost of change and reduce your cost of change, that in itself is a whole category of process, the change process. That overall people think, okay, well, a company who's got a change process that's a little higher than their competitor, over time, they will go out of business. They will fail. Even if they're selling the same products, same quality, and they're doing it at the same speed. They're changing and they're adapting to market need at the same speed. Your cost of change, your cost of navigating transitions from one state to another. It's a game. It's a background game that people aren't navigating.
And there's only one reason why. At any given time, most organizations have a debt of more activation energy than they possibly have the money or resources to apply, because most projects
Yeah.
aren't sticking to the fundamentals. So if you look at the graph, it's almost impossible. But that's also because most projects don't get the return of investment that anybody expected them to get or hoped that they would get. And certainly not all the benefits that everybody touts at the beginning of a project, that nobody's thinking about. Okay, there's a lot of work that gets to the point, the transition, that the state that you need to go through to get to any of those benefits. So
Well, and that topic there, and I know, Jonathan, you feel very passionate about that one, which is portfolio management. And this goes back to, again, some of the fundamentals, which is being aware of where you are, being aware of how much budget you have to make changes or to do projects. And if you've got this activation energy that you're aware of, it changes the way you think about it. Because if you've got, 6 projects that you're putting together, and you have the budget for the projects, but you're not thinking about the additional budget it takes to actually push through the productivity losses, the change resistance. When you don't frame it that way, you shouldn't be doing 6 projects, you should be doing 4, or shouldn't be doing 3. And it goes back to our core theme of do not engage in activity that either can't be finished, fundamentally can't be finished, mathematically can't be finished, impossible, because that's the biggest waste you can take on, which is activity for its own sake.
But just start remembering the fundamentals, and that's how you don't have to get too enmeshed in really understanding or get lost in all the work streams that are developed and all the different elements of a project. If you could just remember change equals cost, and the relationship between where you are and where you're going, and that delta is going to dictate that cost, and which includes all the effort that goes into getting to the new state. You'll already always have an intuitive sense as to whether or not enough is being done for a given project, and of people being realistic about what needs to be done. So I think it's good
And
to just start taking away some of these fundamentals.
and
You're going
that's
to
where Truvle is starting to make the fundamentals applied at a more advanced level to help progress the conversation. To the points Jonathan just made, if you know the higher magnitude or the more complex it changes, the more activation energy will necessarily come with it. You can start to hone your intuition or strengthen it because you know the basics and you know, okay, well, this is going to be multiple departments, multiple stakeholder groups. It's going to include the entire company versus a single group. There's all these dimensions on the slider that as you tally them up as a quick sort of calculation, the activation energy is stacking exponentially. That complexity is going to, by its nature, have to put the company in a tenser state and a higher cost state for a period of time if they're going to make it through the project. And if you can't embark on that, because no one sells it that way, so no one's talking about it. If you can't embark on that, then don't try. When's the last time you went to the CEO's office and said, hey, we're going to pitch a solution that's going to get us down, 20% savings on our cost per day for the process, but it's actually going to cost us 50% more for a period of time before we get there. After this conversation, that should seem natural. It's not happening. It's not, nobody sells projects that way. Not happening ever. I've never seen it done one time.
I have a general rule. I try and make sure that any presentation that includes a plan for a future state, a solution, etc., has 10% max on the benefits of it. Because most of the time we see like the benefits are most of the presentation, and people aren't really getting to the reality of what Sam was just saying about well, but it will take 50%, and that has meaning. People always say, yeah, of course there'll be some training, etc., but they're not understanding that this is a calculatable cost and a calculatable impact that, much like in chemistry, would be always there.
Yeah, and that's where I think the science, again, I keep coming back to it. And I'm talking about the natural sciences at this point, not the business sciences. They don't do politics. Chemistry doesn't do politics. Chemistry doesn't try to sell the situation to, like, chemists don't sell the situation to other chemists. They don't have to go in there and say, this is not going to be so bad. We're going to have to put like 50 joules of energy into this to change it from one component to another. You just talk about the facts of it. We want to get there in a similar place. You shouldn't have to go into your CEO's office and be a better salesman than the next department over to get project budget.
Well,
Let that sink in for a second. That's shouldn't be
there
that
are
way.
there are so many resources, books out there about how to pitch your idea and get your idea heard and get your idea out there. So there's a lot of energy in there, but not as much about whether or not the idea would make sense or why, the steps you need to go through to make sure that this is something you should do. So I think we're saying less pitching, less benefits, more reality, and that's going to help people align on what it takes to get something done with the why, with the reason why you were trying to get it done.
And that's the culture shift that you're talking about right there, which is we're not going in to sell. I'm not preparing 2 weeks before I pitch my project to sell the project. I'm preparing to know what the project is, know the parameters, know the realistic elements in play, know how I'm going to have to change from one thing to another, give a realistic impression of costs. I know from project management training across the board that all project managers are trained to try to be more objective and to estimate costs reasonably. But then you get into the field and the company cultures don't encourage it.
There are a lot of we made a joke that it's hard to say do nothing, or sometimes it's better not to do anything. But there are a lot of more progressive books out there that have come out in recent years that do talk about not focusing, and maybe we'll do a book review of, maybe even for a book that one of us wrote
Oh, maybe.
in an upcoming episode. But there are a lot that talk about push back and don't attend a meeting that you think is wasteful, and focus on where you can add value. And this is tying some of that together, because if you can give the why you don't think something has value, or the why you're going to focus your energy on something that you could do have a lot more value, maybe in addition to you adding more value by focusing on not wasteful activity, you'll start bending your organization to do the same and start having some of these same principles. So like, and it starts with simple things like, why are we even meeting right now? Forget about like, why are we having a project? What's the why of the project, and make sure everybody understands it. But like, why are we even talking about having a project? Would be a good starting point. But I think we're getting a little far afield there. So
Yeah. Well, there's so many interesting topics that it poses. But in terms of this conversation, and I think we're getting to a good wrapping up point. Transition states, we've just introduced it as very basics. And as you can tell, it actually spans a lot of the project lifecycle and the operating lifecycle and how you manage operations, because it's talking about managing change. But hopefully, like everything, it will give you a little bit new perspective and new language to talk about something that happens everywhere, but is rarely given its own articulation, I guess is the way I'd put it. And like, you can guarantee from Jonathan and I's perspective, this won't be the last time you hear us talking about transition state. So this is more of like the appetizer round.
And will, this episode, on reflection, it does lend itself to certain visuals that probably would help everybody. So we'll definitely have that posted in our LinkedIn, so so you can connect the two, and share it with others.
And for all you business chemists out there, challenge the models, because we're just introducing them. We love having discussions and having an active debate on new ideas and new principles. So if you've got any comments and you've got any questions or thoughts, we'd love to hear them.